Well, it used to be they didn't have all this big jet travel allowance they have now where they can flit home every weekend. It used to be they had to travel by car. And maybe they got per diem or per mile, but they had to travel by car. So you'd have people like Bob Michael, the Republican leader, and Dan Rostenkowski, who later became chair of Ways and Means, and two other guys would drive back from Washington to Chicago every weekend, 14 hours. They drive all night. And two guys would lie on a mattress in the back of the station wagon. They'd put the seat forward, and another guy would keep the other guy awake all night. Well, that's a good bonding way, because during the course of those 14 hours, you're talking about your wife, your kids, who's sick in the family. You become human beings together. And what you have today is you have this new kind of extreme fighting in politics where there are no rules, there's no restraint. For example, when we elected a president as recently as W, we had something called the honeymoon. Now, everybody's forgotten it already because of Obama. A honeymoon meant that if you elected a president, that you respected him enough to give him the benefit of the doubt for his big votes, the big things he had offered in the campaign. You said you should get a vote on those things. So Tip, when Reagan came in and said, you get a vote on everything you promised the public. I'm going to give you an up or down, your day in court, there's no games, no filibusters, you're going to get your vote. And he said, I'll give it to you by August 1st. Well, that was the genteel way to do politics. Today, there's no honeymoon. The minute Obama gets elected that day, practically Mitch McConnell says, we're going to destroy you, get you out of there as fast as we can. Newt Gingrich is meeting with these guys at a restaurant that night with 6 or 7. I'm planning the guy's demise. Of course you want to defeat the guy for re-election, but you don't make that your number one goal. Big negative. Of course you want to beat him. You're competitive. But is that your reason to be, is to destroy this guy's presidency? April 10th, 1985, Today's Show, Bryant Gumbel is still the anchor. At this hour, a bipartisan delegation is meeting with the new Soviet leader. It's carrying with them a letter from President Reagan asking for a meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev. The leader of the delegation is Speaker of the House Thomas B. Tip O'Neill. Bryant delivered that as if it was totally normal news. Can you imagine today? A delegation led by John Boehner was carrying a message from Barack Obama to Putin. It's just not the way we do business anymore. The sense of unity was taken for granted in those days. I don't want to make it like Schmaltz, but it was true. It was simply a different time.
People in this country want to feel better about the government. They want to feel better about the country's future. And I think that's what Kennedy still gives people. People remember that Kennedy said he'd put a man on the moon, that he called his administration the New Frontier. See, he's frozen in our minds at the age of 46. 50 years from now, will there be a gathering like this again to remember Kennedy? I think it depends a lot on what happens with the presidency over the next 50 years. If another president comes along who captures the country's imagination and sort of becomes heroic, thrills the country with their leadership, I think it'll eclipse Kennedy. But as long as there is the feeling that these presidents are stumbling and not all that effective, people will continue to turn to Kennedy and to Reagan, you see, who said, "Morning in America, the pride is back." See, I don't think people remember what presidents do. You think they remember that Theodore Roosevelt put the Food and Drug Administration in place, or that Wilson was the architect of the Federal Reserve, or that even Roosevelt did Social Security? You know, about that elderly man who said, "I don't want the government fooling with my Medicare." See, do they know Johnson and that it's a federal program? But they remember some of the words. They remember some of the rhetoric, you see. That Roosevelt said, "Nothing to fear but fear itself." Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." That Reagan said, "It's morning in America and the pride is back." They remember these inspirational talks, you see.
Well, people often ask me about why Congress is so cumbersome and slow and frustrating. And I usually explain that the Constitution designed it to be cumbersome and slow and frustrating. And if it is cumbersome, slow, and frustrating, it's doing what the framers had in mind. If they wanted an efficient system, they would never have created the United States Senate. They would have created a parliamentary system, which most of the power was in the House of Representatives, and we would be the sort of the House of Lords where the former prime minister went to read the newspaper. But we created a system that there's constantly looking over everybody else's shoulder, that to get anything done in Congress, even when all the stars are aligned, even in the 111th Congress, when both chambers were controlled by the same party, and the president was from that party, and it was an incredibly productive Congress. But as you remember, it was a really messy Congress to get anything done, because to get any piece of legislation through is a messy process. The voters then added an extra check onto it all by giving control of one house to another party, so that there's constant struggle back and forth between the two sides. But it seems to me that's what the Constitution set up. It was designed in many ways, as one political scientist years ago called it, as an invitation to struggle. And boy, are we struggling.
You know, we now almost take it for granted that it's a court with 4 on one side and 4 on another side and Justice Kennedy in the middle, and we assume that, you know, it was always that way. But that's really a kind of a modern development. I mean, early in the not too distant past, it was kind of maybe 3 on one side, 3 on one side, and 3, you know, a Potter Stewart, a Lewis Powell, a Byron White in the middle, so that people arguing to the court had to make a kind of a broader based argument, and they weren't just going to, you know, what will it take to move Anthony Kennedy. So I think the perception that the court has become part of the partisan polarization is in part responsible for the fact that the court is now below 50% in the public opinion polls. It's a little hard to disaggregate that from the, you know, general sour feeling about the government.
There are 39 million people who live in California. There are 550,000 people who live in Wyoming. They both have the same number of senators. That is ridiculous. That is undemocratic and wrong, and it is, and you know, we can explain why that happened. Everybody knows about the Connecticut Compromise, which is, you know, I was just reading about it as I was walking around the display cases, that, you know, in order to get a unanimous vote of the states at the Constitutional Convention just down the block, the big states had to give something up to the small states, and they came up with the Connecticut Compromise, where the big, you know, you had one house of the legislature that is based on proportional representation, and the other that is just 2 people a state. Now, that's why it happened, but that doesn't mean it was a good idea. And I think part of the dysfunction, and you know, this is just one easy to cite example, is the undemocratic nature of the Senate. We tend to sort of have this automatic lip service we pay to the Constitution. Well, of course the Constitution's perfect. And the whole idea behind the piece is it's not perfect, is that there are structural problems that go back to the framing, and that's worth noting and paying attention to. Let's not overstate the importance of constitutions. You know, the culture of a country, the history of a country has a lot more to do with how free a country is than words written on a particular piece of paper. I mean, I don't want to say that the Constitution is not important. Of course it is. But, you know, Egypt, Libya, Lebanon, you can write anything you want on a piece of paper and call it a constitution. They are not going to have the free system that we have. And, you know, with all our problems, I think we can all agree we live in a very great country, and it's not because of the Constitution alone. It's because of the whole package of institutions that we have here. So, yes, it's true that some constitutions, you know, South Africa is maybe, you know, more preferable as a piece of political science, but I'd sure rather live here than there.
Well, first of all, this idea that you could only have a republic, a representative form of government, you could only have it in a really small society where everyone thought alike and believed alike. And Madison's first insight was, well, that's a fiction. Anytime you get 3 people together, there are going to be differences. And as he continued to ponder this problem, he realized that a big republic was even safer for individual rights than a small one, because in a big republic there would be so many different opinions, so many different interests represented, that no one of them was likely to prevail and oppress the rest. So that, I call Madison a genius in the book, and I think that his genius was in being able to break through conventional wisdom and see in a way that hadn't been seen before. And this was certainly one of his breakthrough thoughts. You know, he would totally understand that as the nation has grown, the government will grow. But to see, you know, I just try to imagine him driving through Washington, D.C. and seeing tall building after tall building full of people who were, you know, interested in your tax records, for example. The government, in his view, he would have thought it had grown too large. He also would have said, though, that if you don't like it, fix it. You know, it's a government of we the people. If you don't like what the party in power is doing, organize. Get your own political party moving in the right direction. That's the essence of a republic. When you don't like what the government's doing, work to change it. And so I don't think he would be totally discouraged. He would be just dismayed. I've asked myself, why was Madison so successful as a politician? And one of his rules was, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the possible. You know, he wanted to have proportional representation across the board. But in the end, when that proved not to be possible, he accepted what had happened and moved forward.